Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take the most complex source material and distill it into immediately useful and, well, often pretty astonishing insights.
I think today definitely qualifies as astonishing.
I'd say so.
Yeah.
We're asking a question today that, on the surface, sounds philosophical, maybe even a little bit spiritual, but it's actually rooted very deeply in physics and in information theory.
Right.
The question is this. What if the huge, sprawling structures we all live in, I'm talking about multinational corporations, financial markets, the cities we live in, even the algorithms that run our digital lives, what if they aren't just complex machines?
Or, just sophisticated spreadsheets.
Exactly. What if they are, in a very literal sense, living organisms?
And that mechanical or spreadsheet view, I think it's really limited our understanding of power and complexity for way too long.
It seems so.
So our deep dive today is based entirely on a pretty rigorous analysis of these macro systems through the lens of something called general systems theory, or GST. And our mission here is to move far, far past metaphor. We're aiming to identify what the source calls hidden organisms based purely on their process. So what they do, not on their substrate.
Not what they're made of.
Not what they're made of. We're looking for a generalized methodology to detect these lifelike, self-sustaining entities that operate as a single, unified whole.
So we're basically hunting for a kind of biological fingerprint that works whether the thing is made of carbon or silicon or capital.
That's it, exactly.
The core hypothesis here, then, is that any complex adaptive system, once it crosses a certain threshold of, let's say, integration and efficiency, it stops being a pile of parts.
Right, like a heap of stones.
It moves from that to a self-organizing hierarchy. And the key thing is, once it hits that point, it starts operating with a defined, inherent systemic will.
And that's the intellectual jump, isn't it? It's the jump from just describing complexity to actually classifying life. We're trying to define life outside of the lab, outside of biology, by looking at its capacity for, functional coherence. The moment that complexity starts to serve the continuous survival of the whole, that's the moment you have an organism. It doesn't matter what its size is or what it's made of.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because this sounds incredible. I mean, if I look at a massive corporation, I see thousands of people, independent people making their own decisions. I see buildings, supply chains, bank accounts.
A pile of parts.
A pile of parts. So how can you insist this is functionally alive and not just the result of, billions of coordinated human choices?
Yeah.
What's the foundational difference that gets rid of that ambiguity?
So we establish that foundation by insisting that the system has to operate as a single lifelike whole. And to do that, we need some universal tests.
Okay.
We're intentionally moving away from biological terms like DNA or digital terms like code. We're looking at 4 universal criteria, 4 functional markers that define these self-sustaining, entropy-fighting entities, and they have to work across any complex environment. This is the architecture of macro life.
And we have to hold these criteria up to the light, right? Because if a system fails even one of these markers, then it's back to being a machine or a heap or just a collection of interactions.
Precisely. It has to be a comprehensive test.
But if we find all 4...
If we find all 4, then the classification shifts entirely.
Okay, let's start with the building blocks. If these macroorganisms are built of units, people, computers, whatever, how do those units stay individual while also serving this higher entity? That brings us to marker 1, functional modular autonomy.
Right. This is the core definition of the unit within the system. The idea is that the system is composed of discrete, self-contained units.
The parts.
The parts. And they have their own internal logic. They're capable of independent processing and, decision-making. Think of them as really sophisticated autonomous cells. I mean, you, the listener, you're a highly autonomous cell within whatever corporate or economic body you serve.
But hold on. If I'm an autonomous unit, say I'm an employee or a stock trader, I can choose to leave. I can trade against the market's interests. That feels like real independence. How can I be both autonomous and a module?
And that's the subtlety of it. The criterion is just that the units have to be capable of independent existence, or at least local decision-making. You're not a mindless cog. You have agency.
Right.
But here's the surprising part. The system is engineered to harness your local self-interested choices, your desire for a promotion, for financial security, and it aligns those choices with the global output of the larger system.
So the system is actually using my own ambition as fuel. It doesn't need to control me directly. It just creates an incentive structure where my best self-interest also happens to serve its best interest.
That's it, exactly. The system manages to harness local self-interest and points it toward global stability. Think of like a complex neurological network. Individual neurons fire based on local inputs.
Their own little world.
Their own little world, but their collective autonomous firing creates this emergent global thing we call consciousness. So the test for marker 1 is this. Does the unit have its own internal agency while still contributing measurably to a global result?
And I guess, can it be replaced?
Yes. If an individual unit stops existing, you quit your job, a server node fails. Does the system recognize that loss? And does it have mechanisms to eventually replace or compensate for that unit? If the answer is yes, you've got modular autonomy.
That's fascinating. Because it means the inefficiency we always complain about in big companies, the bureaucracy, the seemingly conflicting interests, that's actually proof of its aliveness.
Oh, so?
It's proof that the system is integrating truly independent modules. It's not just running a simple pre-programmed script.
That's a great way to put it. Now, if you have these autonomous parts, they have to be organized somehow. That brings us to marker 2, information-driven governance.
The logic of the system.
The logic, the mechanism that turns all this complex input into coherent collective action.
People often call this the brain or the operating system, right?
I think it's better described as the nervous system, or maybe the endocrine system. It's this constant regulatory signal that's flowing through the whole body. The criterion here is the necessity of a consistent signal that regulates the system.
Can that be centralized, like a CEO?
It can be centralized, like a CEO's direct order, or it can be highly distributed, like market demand. The point is that this mechanism has to process feedback from the environment and then dictate the appropriate collective behavior of all those autonomous units.
So what kind of signal are we talking about here? In a corporation, I guess that would be corporate policy, maybe the annual budget.
Absolutely. In a human society, that signal could be constitutional law. It could be religious doctrine or just, evolving social norms. In a digital platform, it's the recommendation algorithm.
The algorithm is the governance.
It absolutely is. And the test is whether a visible feedback loop exists that specifically rewards healthy behavior. And by healthy, I mean behavior that contributes to the system's stability and coherence. And it punishes, or at least ignores, maladaptive behavior.
Okay, so if you're a department that consistently undermines the company's core function, the governance system, it's going to eventually restructure you, defund you, or just get rid of you.
It has to. It has to for its own survival.
What about in a financial market? Say a high-frequency trader makes a risky but profitable move that creates huge instability for the market as a whole. It was profitable for that unit.
But it threatened the whole. So the system, maybe through new regulations or just a rapid market correction, eventually punishes that instability because the coherence of the whole is always prioritized over the profit of the part.
The signal prioritizes the homeostasis of the collective.
Exactly. The governance mechanism is like a thermostat. It's constantly adjusting the behavior of all these autonomous units to keep the system within a viable operating range. This constant search for equilibrium that is fundamentally a life process.
And that regulatory effort must require a massive amount of energy, which brings us perfectly to marker 3, resource metabolism. You can't fight the second law of thermodynamics, even if you're a giant organization.
This is the thermodynamic requirement for macro life. It's a non-negotiable. The system requires a continuous intake of external fuel.
Resources, inputs, raw energy.
Whatever it is. And that fuel is then converted into useful energy and distributed throughout the structure to prevent entropy, to prevent system decay.
And entropy in this context, it's not just rust or things falling apart, right?
No, it's the breakdown of complex structure. It's a city's roads crumbling, a corporation's process becoming slow and disorganized. That's entropy in a system.
So the criterion here is that the system has to have a clear circulatory requirement. Something has to be flowing constantly, and that flow is what fights the disorder.
Think about what actually stops entropy. It's the constant repair and maintenance of complex structures. For a corporation, that's capital flow, it's profit, it's reinvestment.
For a digital platform,
It's not just money, it's the continuous influx of human attention. It's processing power, it's data. For a city, it's the constant inflow of electricity, water, raw materials, and of course the tax revenue that's used to maintain the water treatment plants, the power grid, the road networks.
that maintenance part is critical. If the roads aren't fixed, if the servers aren't cooled, the structural complexity of the organism just immediately starts to degrade.
And this is where the aliveness becomes, I think, undeniable. The critical test is the dependency. If you cut off the primary metabolic resource, the capital, the attention, the nutrients, does the entire structure undergo a synchronized collapse?
So it's not just that it gets sick.
No, it fundamentally dies. It dies because it can no longer generate the energy it needs to fight entropy and maintain its complex structure, this metabolic dependency. It's the same driver that compels a lion to hunt or a tree to seek sunlight. It's a universal requirement for life.
Okay, I see the necessity, but I have to push back a little on the language. A factory needs constant electricity to run. If you cut the power, the factory stops. We don't call the factory alive, we just call it broken. What's the difference?
That's a great question. The factory is a tool used by the corporation. The corporation itself, the macro-organism, is the entity that converts that external fuel into internal energy and then chooses where to allocate that energy to maintain its own stability.
So the factory is just a component, an inert one.
Exactly. The factory, in this analogy, is like a mitochondrion in a cell. It's a power plant, but it's not the organism. The corporation, on the other hand, it has functional modular autonomy, its employees. It has information-driven governance, its executives and policies. And it has this resource metabolism, its cash flow cycle. When the factory breaks, the corporation redirects resources to fix it or replace it.
But when the corporation's metabolism fails,
The entire hierarchical structure collapses. It's that systemic, self-directed struggle against entropy that defines life here.
that clarifies the scope. Okay, that brings us to marker 4, which feels like the culmination of the first 3. Emergent self-preservation.
Absolutely. If a system is autonomous and it's governed and it's metabolically dependent, it must possess a survival drive. It's the logical conclusion.
Now, the core definition here is that the collective starts to exhibit behaviors that no single individual unit possesses.
Specifically, this primal, almost non-rational drive to protect the whole, even if it comes at the expense of specific parts.
Let's go back to the corporate example. An individual department wants to grow. Every single employee wants job security. But if the corporate organism has to cut an entire division to survive a financial crisis, it will do it without a second thought.
That sacrifice is the criterion. The system must possess a clear immune response. But you brought up an excellent point earlier. How is this different from a CEO just making a cold, rational, cost-benefit decision?
Right. I mean, I calculate the cost of a surgery before I decide to get my appendix removed. I don't feel like it's an instinctual self-preservation of my appendix. It's just a calculation.
The difference is emergence. The calculation of the CEO or of political leaders, it's not a purely individual calculation. Their decisions are shaped, they're constrained, and they're often necessitated by this intense systemic pressure to maintain the organization's existence.
So it's not really a free choice.
Not entirely. When a massive market intervention happens, it's not one person rationally deciding to save the system. It's a rapid collective action by dozens of actors, regulators, central banks, politicians, all responding to an existential threat. The test is whether the system can identify and strategically expel elements that threaten the integrity of the collective. That action demonstrates a systemic will that overrides the intentions or even the survival of its individual parts.
So when we see a nation-state suppressing a radical internal faction, or a city government rapidly deploying resources to quarantine a neighborhood during a crisis, we're seeing this emergent self-preservation property in action.
Exactly. It's the system acting to protect itself against its own internal pathogens or against external shocks. It is the ultimate evidence that the system has transcended the sum of its parts and is now acting as a cohesive entity driven by its own survival imperative.
Okay, so we've laid out these 4 comprehensive tests, but now we hit what feels like a philosophical wall. Are these systems actually alive, or is this still just a very sophisticated analogy to help us understand complexity?
And this is the crucial distinction that general systems theory forces us to confront. The answer depends entirely on how you define life. Are you defining it by its substrate?
What it's made of, carbon, wetware.
Exactly. Or are you defining it by its process, what it does? Self-organization, homeostasis, resource consumption, replication, that kind of thing.
If we define life by process, then the argument for functional aliveness, it just suddenly snaps into place. And that introduces this idea of substrate independence.
Absolutely. We have to recognize that biological life, like you and me, is just one incredibly successful carbon-based expression of a much broader, universal phenomenon, the concept of substrate independence. It analogizes life to software running on different hardware.
I like that analogy.
The fundamental process of life maintaining structure against disorder, responding to the environment, adapting that process, can run on non-biological substrates.
Okay, give us some tangible examples here. What's the hardware and what's the software in these systems?
So in a corporation, the hardware or the substrate is the people, the capital, the physical buildings. But the process, the algorithm of self-maintenance, the drive for profit, the internal culture, that's the life software.
And in a language?
In a language, the substrate is the neural activity and the memory storage inside human brains. The life process is the complex, self-evolving system of information itself. The rules, the vocabulary, the grammar that persists across generations of hosts. The process is identical, only the hardware running the program changes.
Wait, okay, if we're saying a language is literally alive, not just like a virus that needs a host,
Yeah.
what's the single biggest piece of evidence for that functional aliveness? What separates it from just being a complicated machine or a set of rules?
It's the constant, autonomous, evolutionary adaptation in the face of environmental pressure. A machine needs an external programmer to adapt. A living system adapts from within. The greatest evidence is that a language responds to the needs of its users. It invents new words, it sheds archaic structures, it simplifies rules to increase its metabolic efficiency, which is just the ease of communication. And it does all this without a central governing body mandating the change. It's an emergent, self-directed evolution.
That is a profound distinction. It takes the definition of life out of the biology lab and puts it squarely into the realm of physics and information theory.
Which leads to this powerful conclusion you find in the source material. Calling a city or a market an organism is not a poetic comparison. The source says it is a literal classification based on thermodynamic and informational behavior.
Wow.
These are macro-scale life forms, and they utilize humans, capital, and information flow as their cellular and energetic components. They are, for all intents and purposes, functionally alive.
So functional aliveness means we can drop the requirement for consciousness, for emotion, or even for replication through DNA. If an entity consumes resources to maintain its complex structure, if it responds to its environment to maintain stability, and if it actively defends itself against threats, it qualifies.
Correct. And we have to shed what the material calls the intentionality bias, this mistake of equating life with human-like consciousness. These macro systems operate on incredibly efficient but mindless feedback loops. They're much more like the root system of a massive fungus or a colony of bacteria responding to nutrient availability.
You don't think they just persist?
They just strive for structural persistence.
And this structural persistence is driven by what you call the systemic will. This is where the abstract really starts to have practical implications for all of us.
The systemic will is the crucial philosophical shift. The idea is that the macroorganism possesses an inherent directive, a singular overriding drive that fundamentally overrides the intentions of its individual parts. The directive of collective stability and continuous existence. This is the force that defines your environment.
I need a clear example of how this overrides my personal intentions. I choose my job, I choose where I live.
Okay. Consider a large state university system. The university as an organism possesses a systemic will for high enrollment and prestige because that ensures its resource metabolism through tuition and grants.
Makes sense.
Now, an individual professor's deepest intention might be to focus purely on some esoteric low enrollment research, but the systemic will of the university pushes back. It rewards professors who teach popular classes, it punishes departments with low student appeal, and it focuses marketing on high-demand fields.
So the professor's individual intention to pursue pure research is constrained and shaped by the macroorganism's non-negotiable need for survival.
Exactly. The system's desire to survive becomes the overriding force shaping the behavior of all its constituent units, including you.
So, if the definition is so clear under general systems theory, why don't we accept this? Why don't we walk around thinking the city we live in or the company we work for is a living thing?
We face, I think, 3 immediate inherent cognitive barriers to perception. The first one is just the scale disconnect.
It's too big to see.
It's too big and too slow. We're genetically designed to recognize life within a very narrow window of time and space. A dog, a flower, a human lifespan. But macroorganisms operate on vast spatial distances. Their nodes are distributed across continents, and they operate on temporal cycles that span decades, even centuries.
So we miss the life cycle because our own life cycle is just too short to perceive it.
Exactly. Think about the 100-year evolution of a major global currency or the slow, multi-decade adaptation of a foundational political ideology. To a human, the currency fluctuations look like random chaos. The political shifts feel like temporary crises.
But to the organism,
That's just a metabolic cycle. It's a breath, a slow adaptation. We are mistaking the breath for a seizure.
okay, and the second barrier you mentioned is the parts whole fallacy.
This one is very human. We identify so strongly with our individual agency as cells, our free will, our choices, our pursuit of happiness, that we instinctively assume the system is just the simple sum of those choices,
We can't see the forest for the trees.
or the organism for the cells. We fail to see the emergent whole that possesses its own survival instincts, totally independent of our individual intentions.
Hmm.
This bias is incredibly strong because, well, acknowledging the systemic will means acknowledging that our collective actions create an entity that is beyond our individual control.
We're fighting the idea that we are merely, optimized fluid flowing through the system's arteries. We'd rather believe we're the captain steering the ship.
Precisely. And finally, we just come back to that intentionality bias. If we can't perceive intelligence or consciousness that looks like our own, we classify it as a machine. And since these macro systems operate on these efficient but mindless feedback loops, we mistakenly categorize them as complex machines rather than as sophisticated large-scale organisms.
We expect sentience.
But life only requires structural persistence and self-preservation.
Okay, so we have the four markers. We have the concept of substrate-independent life. But these organisms don't exist in a vacuum. They're nested within each other. This leads to the idea of fractal nesting.
Right. The four markers repeat themselves across all scales. They're not fixed to a specific scale. They are recursively applied, so the architecture repeats itself infinitely, up and down the chain.
And this is crucial.
It's crucial because it helps us understand that identity is relative.
The startling realization here is that an entity can be an independent organism, an organ, and a single cell, all at the same time. It just depends on the observer's perspective. It depends on where you decide to draw the systemic boundary.
Let's expand on that idea of relative identity. We talked about a marketing department being an organism to its employees. Let's look further up the chain. That multinational corporation is an independent organism when it's viewed by its competitors or its stockholders. It fights for its own survival, its own profit, its own replication.
But then if we zoom out again,
From the perspective of the national economy, that same multinational corporation is merely a highly specialized cell. Its primary function is the efficient conversion of resources into value, serving the metabolic needs of the national body.
and if that corporation fails,
The national economy organism might suffer a fever, maybe a localized pain, but the economy will sacrifice that cell for its own survival. It will adapt.
this creates these hierarchical chains. We're dealing with a series of Russian nesting dolls. The corporation is a cell inside an industry organ, let's say the global fossil fuel sector.
Right.
That industry organ, in turn, serves as a vital system for the national economy, which ultimately functions as a system within the global civilization.
And the universal application here is that every single level replicates those same four markers: autonomy, governance, metabolism, and self-preservation. The profound implication is that the survival drive of the higher level organism dictates the environment and the constraints for all the lower level units inside it.
Let's use a political example to make this more concrete. Say we have the organism of a city government, and within that, we have individual neighborhood councils or community organizations.
Okay. The neighborhood council is an organism to its local residents. It has its own governance, local bylaws. It has its own resource metabolism, local dues or small grants. And it has a powerful drive for self-preservation. It fights against zoning changes or infrastructure projects that threaten its character.
But the city government organism sees that neighborhood council as something different.
To the city, it's just a highly reactive sensor, an organ that provides localized feedback. If the city needs to pass a new tax or build a major freeway that benefits the health of the entire urban area, the systemic will of the city will override the self-preservation instinct of that neighborhood council.
Absolutely. The survival drive of the larger city dictates the environment for the smaller unit. If the city's tax base needs to be expanded, the city organism will pass zoning regulations that enable that expansion, even if it causes the death of an individual neighborhood's character.
And so the environment you experience every day, the laws, the economic pressures, the social norms, it's not random chaos. It's the deliberate, self-optimizing habitat created by the higher-level organism that houses you.
Okay, now let's take these definitions and really apply them to the real world in detail. We've established our 4 criteria, our biological fingerprint. So let's go out into the wild and see where we can classify these hidden organisms. We need to see how this self-organizing hierarchy, bound by resources and feedback loops, actually manifests. Let's start with the clearest example, corporate organisms.
The multinational corporation is probably the easiest macroorganism to map because its metabolism is so tangible. It uses profit and free cash flow as its oxygen. It's required for the constant repair, maintenance, and growth of the structure.
The metabolism is cyclical.
Very. Revenue intake, expense discharge, surplus allocation. These cycles, the quarterly reports, the annual budget cycles, those are the breaths of the organism.
And the anatomy is pretty obvious. Departments are specialized organs. HR is like the reproductive and immune system. R&D is the sensory apparatus. Sales is the resource acquisition arm. And the employees are the cells, turning internal energy into productive output.
And governance is managed by what we call corporate culture. That culture acts as the DNA, the genetic code. It's the intangible set of rules that ensures new cells, new hires, replicate the desired behavior and informational structure of the parent organism.
That's a good point. What about mergers and acquisitions? M&A.
M&A is often the corporation's form of growth and replication. The organism consumes smaller entities, other organisms, to grow its own mass. A failed integration after a merger. That's essentially the corporate organism rejecting a transplanted organ.
And the immune response. How does a corporation protect itself?
Well, its legal department is its defensive shield. Internal audit and security departments are like white blood cells, hunting for internal fraud or informational pathogens. And a hostile takeover. That's basically an external immunological attack by a competing organism.
So the defense mechanisms they deploy, poison pills, shareholder defenses, those aren't just business strategies.
They're instinctual responses to an existential threat. They're designed to maintain the organism's structural integrity, not necessarily to maximize short-term shareholder value.
Okay, if the corporation is the cell, the next level up is the financial market organism. This is a system that seems purely abstract, just numbers on a screen, but it has incredibly physical, lifelike property.
It's a massive distributed organism of pure flow. The anatomy and nervous system are totally intertwined. Traders, investment banks, algorithms. They're the autonomous cells, constantly exchanging information and action. Price action itself is a nervous system signal.
It's broadcasting the health of the system.
In real time, across the entire globe. A stock market crash is like a seizure. A rapid rally is a jolt of adrenaline.
Metaphorically, maybe?
Metaphorically, yes, but functionally, it's a systemic fever or a localized shock. The circulatory system is liquidity, the readily available capital. Liquidity is the blood. Without that constant, massive exchange of value, the capital flow, the system becomes sluggish. It's prone to thrombosis. It can't distribute energy efficiently. That flow is what keeps the entire system warm and metabolically active.
And its self-preservation is rapid and profound.
Extremely. When volatility threatens its structural integrity, the system doesn't rely on individual rationality. It activates a deep defensive reflex. We see this with automated circuit breakers that halt trading to force a temporary equilibrium.
Or on the macro level.
On the macro level, you see synchronized, massive central bank interventions designed to inject liquidity. These are the organism's immediate immune responses, designed to prevent systemic death. They aren't purely rational human decisions. They are pre-programmed survival reflexes of the market entity itself, responding to the threat of catastrophic entropy.
Let's shift to a more contemporary environment. Digital platform organisms, something huge like YouTube or Amazon. They seem like just code and servers, but they're defined by a life form that literally feeds on human attention.
Exactly. The anatomy is built entirely on distributed human effort. User channels, for example, act as specialized cells. Their function is metabolic. They convert external attention, our time, our content creation, that's the raw fuel, into engagement energy, which is the platform's vital lifeblood.
So the platform isn't just selling ads, it's optimizing for the continuous flow of attention. That's its necessary energy source.
Precisely. And its nervous system is the recommendation algorithm. That algorithm is constantly processing sensory inputs, clicks, watch time, shares, comments, to maintain platform homeostasis. And homeostasis for the platform is defined as maximizing engagement.
So the algorithm is a mind constantly adjusting outputs to keep the organism balanced and healthy.
You could see it that way. The circulatory system is the revenue flow, the monetization system, which carries nutrients to the creator cells.
So a sudden shift in the algorithm, where certain creators or types of content are suddenly favored or suppressed, that's a form of governance adjustment.
It's a systemic governance decision. And when a creator cell, let's say a popular channel, gets demonetized or the system adjusts its flow, that interruption causes a localized ischemia, a lack of blood supply.
And that leads to?
It leads to rapid adaptation, the channel changes its content to comply, or it leads to cell death, the channel disappears.
And the immune system.
Automated moderation and content policy enforcement. It identifies and neutralizes foreign pathogens, spam, malicious actors, or content that's deemed toxic to the host integrity. It does this to protect the platform's ability to maintain its structure and continue its resource metabolism.
So if the platform stops protecting its users from disruptive or controversial content, the users leave, the attention flow dies.
And the organism starves. The immune response is all about the preservation of the host environment. Its survival is tied directly to the efficiency of its resource acquisition or attention.
Let's move to the grand scale now. Political and urban organisms. These are maybe the oldest and most resilient macro systems we have. We should probably treat them separately. Let's start with political organisms, a state or a sustained ideological movement.
Political organisms are really defined by their collective will. Individual citizens are the autonomous cells, the foundational ideology, a constitution, democracy, a specific religious faith. That's the genetic code that dictates the organization and the systemic behavior. That code defines the permissible range of complexity and what constitutes health for the system.
The governance here isn't just the physical capital city, it's the entire framework.
Right. The legal frameworks, the electoral processes, the established social norms, they provide the regulatory feedback loop. They tell the citizen cells how to interact and where the boundaries are. If the organism is a democracy, the signal is feedback through voting. If it's an authoritarian regime, the signal is top-down control. But in both cases, the system is striving for stability relative to its own ideological code.
And the self-preservation of a political organism is probably the most powerful we observe.
It's the deepest survival instinct. The state develops this elaborate immune system, which includes the military, police, intelligence agencies, and critically, propaganda and education systems. Propaganda functions to neutralize internal pathogens, dissenting, or revolutionary ideologies that threaten the integrity of the genetic code or external threats.
And it uses the collective resources of its cells.
It has to. Taxes, military service. It uses those resources to protect its host integrity above all else. When a state goes to war, that is the highest form of immunological response.
And then you have the urban organism, the physical city.
A city is a purely resource-driven biological entity. It exists because concentrating resources enhances metabolic efficiency. The infrastructure, roads, power lines, plumbing, fiber optics, that functions as the veins and arteries, moving resources and waste to the residential and commercial cells to keep the tax base alive and the economy flowing.
The metabolism of a city must be absolutely massive.
It's a colossal continuous flow. The city consumes vast quantities of water, electricity, and fuel every single minute, converting that raw input into economic activity and human stability. And at the same time, it has to manage the massive energy cost of waste removal to prevent internal toxicity.
And its immune system.
Zoning laws and law enforcement. They maintain the structural boundary and act as the immune system, preventing incompatible land uses or criminal behaviors from disrupting the collective metabolism. The city is in a constant fight to maintain a positive energy balance. If its outflow-like population and business migration exceeds its inflow tax revenue and investment, the city shrinks or dies.
Finally, let's touch on the most abstract living architecture we analyzed, language organisms.
Language is a purely mimetic life form, and it fulfills every single marker. It's substrate independent, it runs on the wetware of the human brain, it evolves and adapts to its environment, the changing societal needs of its speakers through the mechanism of mimetics. It's continually acquiring new hosts every time a child learns to speak.
And it fulfills the metabolic requirement.
By ensuring its own use and replication. Every time you use it, you're feeding it.
So what are its anatomy and its replication mechanisms?
Words and syntactical rules are the memes, the structural components. They're units of information that reside in and replicate through the human brain. Every time you speak or write or even think, you are performing a metabolic function that ensures the language persists as a coherent, evolving whole. The ease with which a language allows communication that defines its metabolic efficiency.
And this abstract entity even has an immune system to resist fundamental changes.
It does. Formal grammar, established literary canons, dictionaries, they act as the immune system. They resist mutations, extreme slang, structural simplifications, foreign concepts that threaten clarity, that are deemed unhelpful to the system's overall function. While languages must change to adapt, they resist chaotic change that would compromise their ability to function as a stable vehicle for communication.
That resistance is self-preservation.
It is the self-preservation of the informational entity itself.
So the survival drive of the English language, for example, ensures that while we adopt new words all the time, the fundamental grammatical structure stays coherent enough to maintain its identity across centuries.
That structural persistence across generations of human hosts is the ultimate proof of its functional aliveness. It's a persistent entity defined by its process, not by the bodies it happens to inhabit. So, to synthesize what we've really dug into in this deep dive, I think the central finding, using the rigor of general systems theory, is that these complex structures, cities, markets, corporations, platforms, even languages, they aren't just metaphors for life, they are literal macro-scale life forms.
That makes us.
They utilize humans, capital, and attention as their cellular and metabolic components. This classification isn't poetry, it's based on the synthesis of thermodynamic necessity and informational behavior.
We've essentially redefined life based on functional requirements, not what something's made of. The key surprising takeaways for me are, 1, the non-metaphorical definition of life. 2, the fractal nesting of organisms, this idea that identity is relative. And 3, how our own inability to perceive life at these vast scales leads us directly to the parts-whole fallacy.
We're struggling to see the organism because we're too busy being its highly autonomous cells.
Exactly.
And that failure of perception has some profound implications for how we view our place in the world and, crucially, how we view our own agency. We define the systemic will as the overriding directive for collective stability.
So, building on that idea that the systemic will overrides individual intent, we are left with a final provocative thought for you to ponder.
If you are a cell in a corporate organism, which is itself a cell in an economic organism, and the survival drive of that higher system dictates the environment for your lower level existence, the job you take, the resources you consume, the stability you enjoy, and even the very choices presented to you for what a successful life looks like.
To what extent is your individual agency truly your own? Or is it merely the optimized, highly autonomous function of a much larger living entity, seeking only its singular continuous survival?